Right now, the largest reservoir in the United States is failing in a way that is neither slow nor theoretical, marking a catastrophic decline for 40 million people. The ghostly white ring carved into the canyon walls above the current water line tells a grim story that official government press releases will dare to admit. This infrastructure, which provides essential water for farming and survival, just received an emergency repair bill totaling $1.4 billion to prevent a complete and total system collapse. The water wars that scientists have warned about for many decades are no longer a distant threat coming in the future. They have officially arrived at our very doorstep. As of April 2026, the massive reservoir known as Lake Mead sits at approximately 31% of its total capacity, which is a truly staggering and terrifying number. Imagine a reservoir that was once filled to the brim in 1983, powering the explosion of Las Vegas, now standing less than one-third full in this current year. The Bureau of Reclamation has issued 3 consecutive Tier 3 shortage declarations since 2022, which is the worst possible classification within the federal water management framework. Arizona alone has been forced to absorb massive water cuts, exceeding 51% of its total Colorado River allocation, while Nevada has had to absorb 21% cuts. Mexico is also receiving reduced water deliveries under international treaty obligations that have now become functionally impossible for the United States to honor in full due to the drought. This bathtub ring is not just an aesthetic scar on the landscape. It is a damning geological record of the structural stress currently being endured by the canyon walls. These exposed canyon walls are today experiencing extreme temperature fluctuations and erosion patterns they were engineered to handle, leading to significant structural concerns for the entire dam. Official modeling updated in February 2026 projects that Lake Mead could reach dead pool elevation by 2029, meaning no water would flow through the intake. At that point, the 226-meter concrete arch of the dam would sit uselessly in a dry canyon, unable to provide power or water to the southwest. Hoover Dam was completed in 1935 as the largest dam ever built, remaining one of the most consequential pieces of infrastructure in all of American history, even today. The engineering achievement made the modern American Southwest possible, anchoring the water management systems for Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and the surrounding agricultural metropolitan areas in the desert. This is Taitsao. The Bureau of Reclamation's Emergency Infrastructure Assessment, released in January 2026, landed with the force of a massive geological tremor across 7 different states. The report documented $1.4 billion in urgent repair and retrofitting needs across the Hoover Dam and the critical Lake Mead intake systems to prevent failure. These are merely recommended upgrades or future planning investments, but emergency repairs required when engineers are genuinely worried that a critical system is about to fail. The assessment specifically documented stress fracturing in 2 of the secondary intake towers, which are massive concrete structures responsible for channeling water into the 17 hydroelectric generators. These fractures are directly attributed to accelerating exposure because sections of the infrastructure that spent decades submerged are now experiencing atmospheric exposure and thermal cycling for the first time. Concrete that was originally engineered to live deep underwater is today living above it, and it is unfortunately Hung Sir Lee Duk the transition to these new environmental conditions well. The intake valve mechanisms, which regulate the water flow through the dam, recorded failure events at a rate of 400% above the historical average over 36 months. Engineers monitoring these vital systems describe the failure pattern as consistent with accelerated material fatigue, meaning the equipment is simply wearing out much faster than it was ever designed. Even more alarming is the status of Hoover Dam's 2 bypass tubes. The low-water infrastructure, added in the 1950s to allow water delivery when reservoir levels drop significantly. These tubes have been operated at full capacity for a sustained period, yet they are about to be tested in ways their original designers could have anticipated. Bureau engineers confirmed in March 2026 that preliminary pressure testing on these bypass systems revealed microfracturing in the original concrete lining that requires immediate and extensive repair. The $1.4 billion figure covers emergency concrete remediation, intake valve replacement, bypass system restoration, and the installation of much more enhanced monitoring infrastructure for the dam. Although Congress approved an initial emergency allocation of $340 million in February 2026, the remaining funding is currently caught in a very heated appropriations debate. This debate in Washington could take anywhere from 6 months to bao to resolve, depending on who you ask, while the cracks in the concrete simply refuse to wait. The massive concrete structure, once a symbol of human triumph over nature, today stands as a vulnerable giant, struggling to adapt to a reality that is changing far too quickly. Every day that passes without these repairs increases the risk that the intake systems will become completely inoperable, leaving Kuzun without their primary source of water. We are witnessing a race against time where the physical decay of our most important infrastructure is moving significantly faster than our political ability to fund and fix the problem. If the intake valves fail, or the bypass tubes cannot hold the pressure, the entire southwest corridor will face an immediate humanitarian crisis that no amount of money can solve. To understand why Lake Mead looks the way it does in April 2026, we must travel far upstream to exactly where the Colorado River is born. We journey to the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming and Colorado, where the river begins as snowpack accumulation at elevations reaching well above 11,000 feet in the air. The river that eventually reaches Lake Mead, after traveling 1,450 miles, must survive evaporation, massive agricultural withdrawal, municipal extraction, and an increasingly brutal warming climate. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 allocated 16 million acre-feet of water per year among the 7 basin states, but this was built on a lie. Here is the number nobody in 1922 wanted to confront. The river has actually delivered 16 million acre-feet in an average year of recorded measurement. The historical average flow is actually closer to 14.8 million acre-feet, meaning the compact was built on optimistic hydrology during a very wet period. In April 2026, 104 years later, we are still legally operating under those inflated numbers, while the physical river continues to shrink and disappear. The 20-year running average annual flow measured at Lee Ferry in Arizona has dropped to only 11.3 million acre-feet, a 23% reduction from baseline. Hydrologists at the University of Arizona have reconstructed the river's flow record going back 1,200 years using ancient tree ring data to find the truth of this. Their findings are not encouraging because the past 23 years represent the driest sustained period in the entire 1,200-year reconstruction of the Colorado River's historical flow. This is not a normal drought cycle but a fundamental restructuring of the climate system that feeds the river, meaning the water is coming back as before. The Rocky Mountain snowpack, which acts as a natural reservoir, measured at only 44% of the average as of March 2026, a truly devastating statistic. What snowpack does accumulate is melting much earlier, running off faster, and evaporating into the dry air before it can even reach the reservoirs located further downstream. In 1980, the Colorado River flowed uninterrupted from its headwaters all the way to its delta in the Gulf of California, creating a vast and lush wetland ecosystem. Today, that delta is a graveyard because the Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean, disappearing instead into the desert floor in northern Mexico, absorbed by total withdrawal. The river is not just sick, it is being drained dry by a civilization that refuses to acknowledge the limits of the natural world it depends on for survival. Lake Mead is the account that shows the balance of this bankruptcy, a visible measurement of exactly how far we have already fallen as a society and civilization. As we look at the cracked mud of the shoreline in April 2026, we must realize that the water we promised each other simply does not exist anymore. The crisis of the Colorado River is a warning that our legal documents and political boundaries are completely meaningless when the physical environment can no longer support our demands. 40 million people are now waiting for a miracle that the climate models say is coming, while the river that made their lives possible continues to bleed out. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 divided the entire basin into 2 divisions, assigning specific water allocations to Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Nevada. California received the largest share of 4.4 million acre-feet, while Arizona was allocated 2.8 million, and Nevada received a tiny 300,000. In 1922, Nevada's population was only 77,000, and nobody saw Las Vegas transforming from a railroad stop into a massive metropolitan area of millions. Today, that complex legal architecture is buckling under the immense weight of a river that physically cannot deliver what the historical documents say it owes to each state. The new management framework supposed to replace interim guidelines collapsed in March 2026 without a final agreement between the 7 basin states and the federal government. This total breakdown came over a single intractable dispute regarding exactly how deeply California's senior water allocation must be cut before the junior rights holders absorb any more pain. California argues its senior entitlements must be honored first, while Arizona and Nevada argue that seniority is a mechanism for California to drain the entire system dry. The Bureau of Reclamation issued notice in March 2026 that it will implement unilateral shortage protocols starting in June if no voluntary agreement is reached. Under these proposed federal cuts, California faces a massive reduction of approximately 700,000 acre-feet, which would be economically catastrophic for the state's huge and powerful agricultural industry. Arizona faces additional deep cuts on top of the Tier 3 reductions already in place, making their existential water crisis thumb-chi more desperate than it was 12 months ago. Nevada faces cuts that represent a significantly lower percentage of its municipal water supply than any other state, despite having the smallest numerical allocation among the 3 lower basin states. The political response has been predictably aggressive, with California's congressional delegation characterizing the proposed federal cuts as a legal overreach that ignores decades of established water law and treaties. In Phoenix, the governor held a press conference describing the situation as existential, while Nevada's senators introduced emergency legislation to accelerate funding for critical alternative water supply infrastructure projects. The Bayer state governors have not even been in the Kung Room together since a summit in Salt Lake City in January 2026 ended without a joint communique. Right now, in April 2026, the Colorado River Compact is functionally unenforceable because the water it was designed to allocate simply no longer exists in the required volumes. The 7 states that built their entire economies on the Jardin of Nung water allocations are Jode circling each other like desperate attorneys at a massive federal bankruptcy proceeding. This is exactly what we are witnessing: the total bankruptcy of a river and the collapse of the legal system that attempted to control it for over a century. Every glass of water in Phoenix, and every head of lettuce in the Imperial Valley, is Jode caught in the middle of this massive and escalating legal battle. The Bureau of Reclamation's authority to impose mandatory cuts is being tested as states prepare to sue the federal government over what they consider to be unconstitutional water seizure. Without a unified agreement, the future of the American Southwest will be decided in federal courtrooms rather than through sustainable engineering or cooperative water management between the neighboring states. Dr. Patricia Reyes of the United States Geological Survey has been running Lake Mead collapse scenarios since 2021, and her recent findings are even more terrifying than before. The models she developed 5 years ago projected outcomes for 2029 that are already occurring in April 2026, indicating that the system is collapsing much faster than anticipated. Dead pool elevation sits at approximately 895 feet, and below this critical point, water remains in the reservoir, but simply cannot reach the intake structures for human use. If Lake Mead reaches this dead pool level, the 17 hydroelectric generators will go offline simultaneously, removing 4 billion kilowatt-hours of energy from the Western power grid without replacement. Las Vegas is arguably the most water-vulnerable major city in America, with 90% of its municipal drinking water supply coming directly from the shrinking depths of Lake Mead every day. Although the Southern Nevada Water Authority spent $1.5 billion drilling a third intake, it sits only 12 to 15 meters above the projected dead pool elevation level. Seismologists at the University of Nevada have documented a significant increase in microseismic activity beneath the lake bed because the reduced water weight allows fault systems to move. Phoenix metro area depends on the Colorado River for 40% of its supply, and their sophisticated groundwater banking program has already drawn down its reserves by 32%. Los Angeles is watching two of its three major supply sources fail simultaneously, as Northern California snowpack levels have dropped to only 5% of the total requested water supply. Tucson's water director recently briefed the city council with a presentation titled 2026, the year the plans run out, reflecting the harsh reality that all backup strategies are exhausted. The science of collapse is no longer a theoretical exercise for hydrologists, as the physical limits of the desert are finally catching up with the ambitious dreams of southwestern cities. Every major climate model now treats the high-stress scenario as the baseline reality, projecting a 67% probability of reaching dead pool elevation within the next 3 years. As the water level drops by several meters every single year, the window to save the 40 million people who depend on this infrastructure is slamming shut with relentless speed. Engineering marvels that once tamed the river are now becoming monuments to our failure to respect the natural hydrological cycles of the most arid region in the United States. We are entering a period where the math of water consumption simply does not work, and the survivors will be those who can adapt to a future with much less. Desalination and wastewater recycling are the most discussed options, but they require decades of investment and massive amounts of electricity that the region simply does not have right now. Buying out agricultural water rights could provide a temporary buffer, yet this would mean destroying farming communities that have existed for over 100 years in the dry desert. The window for intervention will remain open for only 3 or 4 more years before the system dynamics become self-reinforcing in ways that are much harder for us to reverse. 104 years ago, 7 states signed a document dividing a river that was Baojo capable of fulfilling the grand promises they made to their future generations of citizens. Every neon light in Las Vegas and every green lawn in Phoenix was built on the dangerous assumption that the Colorado River would always be there to provide for us. The ghostly white ring on the canyon walls says the river made us no such promise, and we must decide if we will finally pay attention before the water ends.